On notification, Nick?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's recording. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenience, truth-telling, and myth-busting. And we are rejoined today. We're going to be talking all about Australia, and we are rejoined by our past guest, Nicholas Beam, or Nick Beam of the Socialist. Beams, exactly. Nicholas Beams, yeah. or as I call him, Nick Beams of the Socialist Equality Party of Australia, and a frequent contributor to the the World Socialist website. And we'll be discussing Australian affairs, the recent election. But before we get into that, well, first of all, Nick, thank you for coming back on the program, especially under such short notice.
Yeah, that's fine. Yep, happy to be here, Youri.
It's an honor to have you back. And actually, Nick, just before we talk about the recent Australian elections and what to expect under the incoming Labour government, your publication and your your international organization, the different socialist equality branches globally, has done phenomenal solidarity work to Julian Assange. And so I would be remiss if I did not ask you if you could please give us any updates on the plight of your fellow countryman, Julian Assange. And yeah, just any updates you can give us and any calls to actions that you would like to pitch to Julian Assange before we talk about the
I think the deportation order by the Home Secretary in England, her name escapes me at the moment.
Priti Patel, right?
Yeah, I think it may come tomorrow. Directly tomorrow. The extradition order. I mean, there's more criminality being revealed. It was revealed, I think, yesterday that Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, was spied on, and there was a settlement made on that, an admission by the British state that they had been doing that. I mean, that just underscores the central criminality of this whole case. But one could say what is even more criminal, perhaps, if that's possible, is the refusal of the entire political establishment in Australia to lift a finger. That is the official political, and that extends above all to the Labor Party, because the incarceration and persecution of Assange began not under the Liberals, not under Abbott, not under Malcolm Turnbull, but under the Gillard Labor government. And she even threatened at one stage to take his passport away. She denounced him as a criminal, and they've been central to this. And the reason is, of course, and it's bound up with the orientation of this and past governments, of Labor governments, is their orientation, their lockstep alliance with the United States. Because Assange has been attacked, incarcerated for 10 years, threatened, the subject of CIA assassination attempts. Why? Because he exposed the war crimes of the United States. And the Australian Labor government, the Australian Labor Party, will not lift a finger in his defence to free him, to use the diplomatic resources they have, which they've done with other people who have been detained, but not with Assange, because that goes too close to home, the US alliance. So anyone who is expecting a change of orientation by this incoming Labor government on Assange has had those hopes dashed, and it just underscores the very nature of this government, which we'll talk about further.
Exactly, and I should mention this, but John Pilger, who has been one of the only, just like you guys at the of the SCP and the World Socialist website, John Pilger has been one of the few people to have stuck by Julian Assange through all the turmoil, while so many others, what you would call the pseudo left, threw Julian Assange under the bus. But Pilcher had mentioned in interviews that Malcolm Turnbull, when he interviewed him, said that he was quite receptive and open to the idea of not, freeing Julian Assange overnight, but at least looking at the case and doing something and being, an honest actor. Of course, that didn't happen under Turnbull, but apparently Pilger again, he tweeted the other day that apparently Anthony Albanese, who's going to be your new prime minister, did say that
prime minister,
the incoming prime minister did say that he thinks Julian Assange should be set free. But,
but this is all fluff and nonsense and BS, and it's designed to throw dust in people's eyes.
Okay.
They are doing nothing. Albanese refuses to lift a finger to defend Julian Assange. I mean, and there are various, and what we are saying is that workers and supporters of Assange have to brush the dust out of their eyes and get to the understanding that it's only the independent mobilisation of workers and ordinary people demanding that Assange be set free that is going to do that task. There's not going to be some whispering in the corridors or backdoor manoeuvres by Labor politicians. They are going to do nothing. Look, it's been 10 years. If they were going to do something, they would have done it long ago. They will not. And Turnbull and anyone who sort of thinks or puts out the position that, well, perhaps if we just whisper in their ear, they might do something, is either deluding themselves or deluding others. I can't put it any more plainly than that.
Well, keep doing the great work that your organization is doing in trying to free Julian Assange and mobilizing people. I hope it all goes well, and I'll have to have my good friend Alfred Zayas back on the program to talk about if anyone in the European, in the different European bodies of government are trying to do anything to stop Julian Assange, because apparently that can be appealed because Britain, even though Britain has left the European Union, they're still a member to various European treaties which deal with issues such as the Julian Assange case. But as you said,
I'm not exactly sure of the legal position, but it may well be up to the British government. And I mean, they have made their position very clear. This whole kangaroo, I don't know what you can call it.
Exactly.
This whole frame-up trial, it's not even a trial. I mean, it's just a judicial frame-up of Assange, which has gone on and on and on.
Yes, and as you said, I mean, it really is up to the working class and anyone who believes in just basic common decency to mobilize themselves, build new networks to get Julian Assange set free.
We found in the course of our election campaign, which we've just conducted, our candidates, our campaigners, found very important support among ordinary workers for Assange, and regarded, it is a travesty that he was locked up. I mean, there is a broad support, as there was when the collateral murder video was released and the other information released over the years. He is seen as a hero to many people who were first made aware of the war crimes committed by the United States by the material that Julian Assange published. So there's broad support.
All righty. Well, well, let's hope, let's hope that this tragedy can be, that the torture of Julian Assange can end and this tragedy can finally end. And that leads us to, so that was my first question I wanted to ask you. So my second question, which this is a very broad one, but I wanted your thoughts on the recent federal election of your country, Australia. The Labour Party won a huge majority, ending a very long reign of the Liberal National coalition led by the far-right Scott Morrison. There's a lot of things I would like to respond to, but I just want first, your impression of it all. And do you think the election of Anthony Albanese, the Labour Party, do you think this happened because this was a protest vote against the Scott Morrison government, and this was the Australian electorate rejecting his extreme right-wing ism? and it's not as if people really have much expectations for the Labour government, but that this was just a protest vote against the grotesque reign of Scott Morrison.
Well, I think, first of all, Youri, I've got to correct you on one thing. Labor did not win a huge majority. Okay. They only just scraped in. In fact,
true.
They lost 600,000 votes in this election. Their vote was actually down from the vote in 2019. About 1 in 6 people who voted Labor in 2019 didn't. That's how much their vote dropped. And most significantly, it dropped in poorer, lower socioeconomic areas. The more, the poorer the electorate, the bigger the swing against the Labor Party. And this is despite the fact that workers are under enormous economic stress here, as they are everywhere else. Inflation is on the rise. Interest rates are on the rise, hitting mortgage home buyers. So the overall vote for Labor dropped. But even more significant, to look at it as a protest vote, right, is to sort of couch it in terms of the normal electoral cycle. One comes in, one. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. The deeper meaning of this election was that it was a collapse of support, a decay in the whole two-party structure within which has been the basis for capitalist rule in Australia in the post-war period, and of course before that with the Labor Party.
Yeah.
You see, the total combined vote for Labor and the Liberal National Coalition was 68%. That's 1 in 3 voted somewhere else. That's been a continuing process over the last several elections. The Labor vote went to an historic low, I think, in 2019. It went down even further at this election. The only reason the Laborites got in was because the Morrison base, the Morrison vote, went down even faster in terms of. So this is not a support. This is not some great mandate for the Labor Party. What we have is the alienation from, disgust with, and outright hostility to the existing setup. Now that's very significant because it has to be seen
so actually,
as part of a global. It's part of a global process. We saw the same thing in the French elections.
I was just about to ask you that. I was just about to make that comparison. That that even though my reaction when I saw the Australian general election was that the good news is that the Liberal National Coalition government lost. The bad news is the Labor government won. the Labor Party won. So this Labor, the incoming Labor Party. But this goes back to my my question, which is did people only vote for them? Those who those who chose to vote for the Labor Party only vote for them as a protest against the Liberal National Party.
Look, when I was a younger man, right, there was a big constituency in the working class for the Labor Party, right? People would say, I'm a Labor man or woman. And they would identify with certain leaders. They would say, I'm a Hawke man or I'm a Whitlam follower. That doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Because nobody has any faith whatsoever in these parties. Now, there may be, and there certainly are, illusions that perhaps, Labor would be better. It was significant, actually, that where the Labor vote actually went up was in the wealthier electorates, the wealthier areas, which also saw a very marked swing against the Liberals through these so-called teal candidates who stood as independents and I think won 5 or 6 seats. So there was
most of those so-called independents, because when I was digging into who are these so-called independents, are all far right parties.
The Teals you couldn't describe as far right. What they say is, and they differ in their attitude. They're part of they come out of the Liberal base, right?
Exactly.
They are backed by certain sections of the capitalist class, particularly those sections who differ with Morrison and the National Party on the question of climate change, but who are very much of a free market orientation. They are certainly no friends of the working class, and they represent, in the final analysis, quite important sections of what could be called green capital, capital that wants to invest in, climate change developments and so on and sees money in that.
Yeah.
And they come out of this liberal base and they gain significant support in key liberal electorates. So they're not far right. They're not the Pauline Hansons. They're not the Clive Palmers. They represent a fracturing of the liberal heartland, which is in the wealthier seats. That's gone or broken apart, but they are very much of, they want lower taxes, free market, but they want some green policies on top, and they want also an end to the blatant corruption of, they're calling for an independent commission against corruption to examine, because there are conflicts within sections of capital over that, doling out of money and so on to various vested interests. So they are a breakup of the sort of the base of the Liberal Party. Wealthy individuals, many of them, would have been, Liberal Party, come from long pedigrees of Liberal Party supporters, but they've broken apart. So we have this fracturing. On the one hand, the base of the Liberal Party has been fractured. On the other hand, the base of the Labor Party in working class, lower socioeconomic areas is also fracturing. So you have the Labor support going down most in those areas and the Liberal support going down most in their areas. So we have a very fluid and fractured situation in which we work, and which we have emphasised. The essential question is the development of an independent socialist movement of the working class. That it does not have yet.
And it's interesting, and I have to say, I had to write this. I was stunned that Labour won because, looking at, because going on Wikipedia and looking at, which newspapers and magazines endorsed which party, only 6 newspapers and magazines endorsed Labour, and that includes The Guardian, The Age, and of course, your version of the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, the Sydney Morning Herald. The Liberal National Coalition got 11 endorsements, much of that from papers owned by News Corporation, Rupert Murdoch, and Sky News, which its Australian branch is very far right, and is very much pro pro Morrison, and is very hostile towards any action on climate change. And the other thing I was very so that's one reason I was quite.
Well, just let me make a point.
Your thoughts on that.
Let me make a point on the Murdoch press, because it's rather interesting.
Yeah.
Because the day after the election, the Sunday morning, when it was still undecided, the Murdoch press came out and said Labor had won the election. Now, under different circumstances, that would not have been the case. They would have said, well, it's too early to count, and so on and so forth. So we have to ask the question, why this turn? First of all, for all those endorsements, all the major press barons and press outlets recognised there was no fundamental difference. But there was one difference which Labor sought to develop in the course of the election campaign. That is that they would be more vociferous, more proactive on enforcing the interests of the United States in the Pacific with regard to China. And so Murdoch came out in support, because what happened on the Tuesday after the election was on Saturday, there was to be a meeting of the so-called Quad, that's the alliance between India, Japan, United States and Australia in Tokyo on the Tuesday. Australia had to be represented. And so Murdoch came out and said, well, Albanese is going to be the Prime Minister. He's got to go. He went there with his Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. That's how important it was. Since then, and it's only, 3.5 weeks since the election, if that, there's been a flurry of diplomatic tours by the Foreign Minister Penny Wong. I think she's made 3 or 4 trips, Albanese to the region, over the question of China, issuing threats to the Pacific Island nations that they have to line up with the US and Australia. So the move by Murdoch on the Sunday was very significant, because he said, and their papers, the News Limited, decided this is the fundamental issue. There aren't differences. In fact, Labor had tried to position itself further to the right of the Morrison government on the question of China during the election campaign.
Yes, even accused Scott Morrison of being a Chinese puppet, which probably went through the heads of most people. But for me, it was like, yeah, because that was.
I don't think he accused him of being a Chinese puppet. What he said, they dropped the ball. China entered an agreement with the Solomon Islands, right? And this came as the Labor Party accusation was that the Morrison government had dropped the ball, was the greatest foreign policy disaster, calamity in post-war history, according to Penny Wong, and that Labor would do much better and be more vociferous on this front. Very interesting, actually, in the context of the US-NATO proxy war, against Russia in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be defending the right of Ukraine to join NATO if it wants to. But the Solomon Islands in Australia's backyard says, well, we want to make a pact with China. Oh, no, that's got to be opposed. And they've gone round to ensure that every small Pacific Island nation does not enter such relations. So there's one rule, when it suits, and another rule when it doesn't. So this issue was I think, the Murdoch press decision to back the Labor Party. As I said, in other circumstances, they would have been screaming from the rooftops. Albanese hasn't got a majority. His vote's gone down. There's no way he should be installed, etc., etc. That was for another time. This time they recognised the collapse of the whole two-party system, and they moved in behind the Labor Party because it had already demonstrated where it would stand on China.
That's a good segue to, this is part of my question about, the election, which is, I was surprised in the 3 televised debates how, Scott Morrison, didn't come across as the kind of, obnoxious, aggressive, and grotesque far-right winger, that he's often described and that he is. I wasn't, impressed at all with Anthony Albanese. And even though, as someone who hasn't been following Australian politics closely in the past, 3 years, I, wasn't impressed with Anthony Albanese. But apparently, where is it? Apparently, in the Sky News debate, Anthony Albanese was deemed the winner by undecided voters, 40% to Scott Morrison's 35%, with 25% still unsure. In the second debate on Channel 9 News, apparently 49% of viewers still preferred Anthony Albanese compared to 45% of Scott Morrison. But apparently, many people, deemed that it was a 50-50, that was a draw. 50%, half the electorate thought Anthony Albanese did a good job, the other half Scott Morrison. Final debate, Anthony Albanese was considered a winner by 59% of undecided voters compared to 34% to Scott Morrison, with 16%, with 16% still undecided. Your reflections on that, the debates in general, and what you would have liked to have seen addressed if.
The characteristic feature of the debates was their complete emptiness. The characteristic feature of the debates was the closeness of their policies on every question. I mean, on the economic front, Labor accepted, the budget, and I'll come to that in a moment, but they accepted complete agreement. They voted for the tax cuts to the wealthy. They voted for the Morrison government's budget. The only difference, as I said, was that Labor raised that they dropped the ball on the question of China. There was no difference. And most people were not affected by what most people said, the debates, I don't think, had any real impact at all, because most people said, or viewing it, well, they're just the same. They're just the same. There's no difference. There was no policy difference between them on the central questions. They both agreed, actually, that Australia faced a very bright economic future. Albanese campaigned on brighter times ahead, a better days for Australia. Morrison, that his budget was working. They all knew this to be lies, because as soon as the Labor government came in, they said, we have a very serious economic situation. The debt is moving towards $1 trillion. We're going to have to take, it completely changed, which they both agreed to cover up during the election campaign. The real serious economic situation facing working class people, which has got very rapidly worse in the 3.5 weeks since this campaign. Now, our party, the Socialist Equality Party, we were the only party who warned this would be the case. A, that the real issues were being covered up, and B, that very rapidly, we didn't know exactly how rapidly, but very rapidly after the election, there would be an offensive against the working class, which they're preparing and which they've already done. They've just hailed a national wages decision which came down yesterday, which I think gives 5.2% to lower paid workers, 186,000, refuses to pass the wage increase on to other workers, and which is in fact a real wage cut when the official rate of inflation is 5%, not counting, the wages you've lost previously, is expected to go to 7% according to the Reserve Bank. And wage increases are being agreed to by the union leaderships of 2 and 3% a year. So they're actually enforcing wage cuts with the support of the Labor government. They've made it very clear that there has to be action taken to cut public spending, except on one item, defence. And the rest, health, education, national disability insurance scheme, those areas, they're going to be subject to attack, and they are already being. So very quickly, the real issues came to the surface. The debates were not debates. They were an exercise in public relations to cover over the real issues with the agreement of the two party leaders. That's how I would sum it up.
Well, you already sort of answered the question, what can we expect from the incoming Labor government? Anything else?
I don't think it's a question of what we can expect. It's what's already happened. Harold Wilson said a week, is a long time in politics. Well, 3.5 weeks is an epoch, you could say. What's happened is, let's take the foreign policy question first. Penny Wong I've never seen anything like it, must have made now, I think it's 4 trips to the Asia Pacific region. That's in 3.5 weeks. She's gone to Tonga, she's gone to Fiji, have gone to Indonesia to strong arm, in defence, and she went to Tokyo. They've had the Quad meeting. They've issued bellicose statements continually, almost every day, against China. That's the first thing. And they clearly got their marching orders in Tokyo. That's what Albanese went there for. Never mind the photo ops and the handshakes and all that nonsense. What goes on behind the scenes is the important thing. And Albanese was very squarely told by Biden, you have the responsibility for the Pacific. You have to ensure that because the Pacific Ocean and these islands, they were strategically important in the Second World War. After all, the Battle of Guadalcanal was one of the major battles of that war. They're very small, but they're strategically significant for any prosecution of any war against China. You have to get them on site. That's your task, and your friends over in New Zealand. That's what you are assigned to do, above all. And Labor said, how far do we jump, sir? Right in line. Also because of protection of their own interests and the interests of Australian imperialism in this region. And then we had, on the other front, the question of the economic situation in Australia. Real wage cuts, warnings of, we have to increase productivity, real wages have to actually be cut. You can't have a real wage rise to keep pace with inflation. You've now got I mean, you've got power prices. We've got a crisis in the east coast of Australia now because the gas companies just shut the power off because they're not getting high enough prices. And we're threatened with power cuts in Australia. You know, abundant resources, but that's the profit system in power, which a market system in the power generation was actually introduced quite a long way back under the Keating government. We've got power prices going up 18%. Interest rates on the rise. You could have a situation very quickly where people on mortgages above $500,000, and that's not a big amount in Australia, with a median house price in Sydney of 1.2, 1.3 million, people have huge mortgages. And with even a very small, relatively small absolute rise in interest rates, the results are catastrophic. You can have workers who are going to be paying on their mortgage $1,000 a month more. That is $1,000 a month more. That's a real wage cut of $250 a week in working class areas. So nothing to do with that. Wages kept down and attacks on already warnings that, you know, social services spending, government spending has got to be cut. So war abroad, war at home. That's the nature of the Labor government. And it's not a question of expecting, it's already happened. Now, people may have illusions. Some people might say, oh, well, let's wait and see. Well, we don't have to. Inflation hasn't waited. Interest rate rises haven't waited. You know, they haven't waited. They're soaring ahead.
That's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, did Labor's victory owe much of it to the support of big teacher unions, big labor unions, healthcare unions, green groups, and racial justice groups? And did many left-leaning groups in Australia simply said you have to, vote for the Labor Party because, lesser evilism and all?
That's an important point you raise. First of all, on the role of the unions, I mean, they, of course, were propping up and promoting illusions in the Labor Party, as they do. They are acting very much as the policemen they did under the Liberals, and they'll continue and deepen it under Labor. I mean, they're the ones who are suppressing the struggles of nurses, of teachers, of public sector workers who are starting now to move into action, and did so before the election quite significantly. We had first teachers' strikes for, a decade and so, and we had aged care workers striking. The trade unions kept these strikes isolated, so one sector would go out, then another sector, for a day, and limited. But the anger is building up, and they promoted, the illusions in Labor. But the most important delusions and illusions have been promoted by the pseudo-left groups, such as Socialist Alliance, who promoted illusions in the Greens, and not only didn't just call for Labor vote as the lesser evil. No, their position was worse than, if it can be, that you put a Labor government in and it can be subject to pressure. You can pressure a Labor government. Well, that's completely wrong way round. The more the movement of the working class develops, in a sense, the more the pressure from below develops, the more vicious will be the reaction of the Labor government and the union bureaucracy from above to suppress this. Because that's what they fear above all else, the independent development of the class struggle. So they played the pseudo-lefts, who also, of course, are the most fanatical supporters, many of them, for reflecting these developments in the upper middle class for the US-NATO war against Russia in the Ukraine. And they're the ones promoting the illusions in Labor. They were also, one should note, those who played a very key role in what we were talking about earlier, the attack on Julian Assange. They said he has to go to Sweden to answer the so-called rape charges, which was the peg on which the British state, hung the whole attack on Assange. The pseudo-lefts supported that. in line with their identity politics.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to respond to the comments that Nick made, they are free to contact me on Facebook, Twitter, or email. But
well, we've documented their positions. I mean, they're not in dispute. We're not arguing about facts. These are facts. I mean, they lined up. Assange must go to Sweden to answer the rape charge. Is completely trumped up. That was their position. They have supported going right back 2011. I mean, they supported the United States intervention in Syria. Corey Oakley of Socialist Alternative said we've got to throw away, this knee-jerk anti-imperialism. The left can't simply line up against America every time it intervenes. That's 10 years ago. So the record is very clear.
And he said that about Syria?
Yeah, he said they supported, we've got to get rid of this knee-jerk anti-imperialism sometimes, and now they have the same script is running in relation to the Ukraine, that this is the defense of little Ukraine and you've got to support the massive pouring in of arms by the United States. Ukraine conflict didn't start on February 24th when Putin ordered the invasion. It started back in 2014 when the CIA and other forces organised a fascist coup in the Ukraine. That's when the preparations for this really got underway. I mean, this could be all over. All the United States, Putin just said, don't extend NATO any further. Come to a deal. Completely refused. Now, that doesn't justify Putin's actions. They were entirely reactionary. But it does place them in their proper context.
And well, before I ask about the indigenous people, then I have to ask a follow-up question to what you were saying about left institutions supporting labor and whatnot. But then I have to ask this question, which is. And it's a question I'm going to ask a lot of people who are part of alternative left parties in the future, which is what's it going to take for the Australian electorate to if they're going to do a protest vote, they vote for the Socialist Equality Party. What's it going to take for the Australian electorate, whether it's the working class or people who want basic common decency to reign supreme, not the grotesque politics that we've been subjected to since the 80s, or people would even say for all eternity. What's going to take for them to not vote for labor and vote for alternative left parties such as the SCP and other Marxist parties. Some Trotskyists, others not.
There aren't any other Marxist parties. We're it. I mean, it's just you establish who you are by what you fight for. These people do not fight for any of the basic. You can't be a Marxist party and say like Corey Oakley, we've got to abandon knee-jerk anti-imperialism, we've got to support the United States. That's a bourgeois party. Now, it's first of all, let me take issue with the premise of your question. The issues are not going to be decided by voting. The struggles of the working class are not going to be decided. It's not a question of lining up an election once every 3 years to decide who votes. That's a very passive situation. What's happening is that enormous struggles are breaking out over wages, over inflation, now, not 3 years down the track at possibly the next election. And the fight is already on. And the fight in these struggles is above all against the trade union bureaucracy, which play the crucial role in strangling the working class. Now, as yet, there have been very important strikes, there have been very important struggles. There's deep hostility to the trade union leaders and the role they're playing, but there is not yet in the working class fighters for a socialist perspective to lead the working class in the struggle against these apparatuses and actually develop its political movement. And that's what we're addressed to, not to the ballot box. So we're fighting for independent rank and file committees of workers. Workers have to have an organisational form to fight. But it's completely false to identify that form with the trade unions. They don't function in the way they used to, and they did in the past, to even a limited extent. They're the policemen of the wage cuts. They're brought in. Biden in the United States declares he's the most pro-union president in history because he wants the union bureaucracy paid on six-figure salaries in the US to strangle, and they've done it time after time after time, struggles of workers. They reject a contract by 90% of the vote, the unions come in to enforce it. Same questions are here, not yet to the same extent, but soon will be. So that's our orientation, not to the ballot box, but above all to the development of workers and young people in the workplace who begin the fight for a socialist perspective, who begin to develop in the working class the understanding that the problems they face on housing, rent, mortgage, prices, you name it, come from an historic breakdown of the global capitalist system. And therefore, the only answer is not some kind of ballot box or prospect for some reforms, but the development of an independent movement of the working class for socialism, which has got to be developed nationally and above all internationally. So we have established the International Alliance of Workers' Rank and File Committees to coordinate this universal struggle, because the battle against the trade union bureaucracy is the same in every country.
Again, before I get to indigenous issues and police brutality, I then have to ask another follow-up question to what you're saying. Can you talk a bit more, because you know, I often hear what you were saying about rank and file, about the need for independent rank and file voting in in unions. Can you talk a bit more about that and explain to people how that works? Because I think a lot of people when they think of certainly a lot of us on the left, when we think of unions, we think that the unions are always there fighting the working class's corner, and I think a lot of people actually don't understand how even unions work and how they're constructed. So can you talk a bit more about that in terms of how we can finally end this vicious cycle of always of lesser evilism and
well, let me make a very important distinction, right? Our fight for rank and file committees, and other people sort of put forward this, it sounds the same, but it's not. Their rank and file committees are aimed at the prospect of reforming the trade unions, making them more answerable. No, ours are not. Our fight is to develop completely organisations independent of the trade unions, independent of them, in a fight against them. It's a different concept, because this is not something we just derived overnight or it's a clever... No, it involves an historical study of the transformation of the trade unions, particularly from the 1980s, with the development of, they previously they never were socialist, they never fought for the overthrow of capitalism, but they previously did fight for certain limited reforms within a national framework. That really ended from the 1980s onwards with the development of globalised production, and then the unions were transformed into organisations that actually police the conditions for their own national capitalist class. So it's not a question of reform within the unions, making them more accountable. A lot of workers look at it like that. Can't we make... No, we tell them straight, you can't do this. They've transformed. They're not what they were. They have the name, and sometimes people get confused by language, but you have to actually identify what an organisation is actually doing. You can't say that an organisation which works from day one of a struggle to suppress the working class, which enforces wage cuts, which in the United States stuff ballots, organised, tears up, ignores vote, is a working class organisation in any sense of the word. So yes, it's a difficult task, but that's what's got to be done. So it's a different concept altogether. It's not to reform the trade unions, but to build organisations of class-conscious, socialist-minded workers, militant workers, the best representatives, to lead the others in a political struggle. And everything hangs on that. The development of an independent fight to prevent, and only in that way, can the betrayals of the union bureaucracy be defeated. And there's a very important corollary to this, which I want to emphasise, because we have also emerging in every country, in one form or another, the development of right-wing fascistic organisations, which prey upon social discontent to the extent that the working class is trapped by the union bureaucracies and is unable to, so to speak, clear the way for the mass of the population to start fighting, to the extent that it's suppressed and other sections of the population lose faith in the working class, then the right-wing fascists will predominate, or at least if not predominate, they can grow and develop. Fascism emerges on disillusionment. And if the working class is shackled by the trade unions, then disillusionment will grow in these disoriented layers, and the fascist and the right wing will have a feeding ground, as Trump has discovered in the United States. It's not isolated to the US.
Or the liberal national coalition always will co-opt those far right movements and conservative party of Brits.
But I think it's a very real. The betrayals of the trade union bureaucracy have consequences, not just betrayals. They provide the feeding ground to the extent that they shackle the working class, which is the only progressive social force in society. They shackle it, they create the ground for these organisations.
And that's a perfect segue to two related questions I wanted to ask you, which is about the indigenous communities of Australia, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders. Did any of the major parties, the incoming Labour government, or even the Greens, did any of them address in their platforms or manifesto how they would address the grievances and concerns of Aboriginal people? And I know you have no high expectations. You only have low expectations for the Labour Party.
The main focus,
but any chance, a treaty similar to what New Zealand has with their indigenous people, the Maori, any chance that will finally happen in Australia with this Labour government?
Well, you see, the main focus of the main position, and they've raised this to the Labour government, is what's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was devised, 4 years ago now, to have a voice to Parliament, independent, representatives of the Indigenous community to advise on, laws affecting the Indigenous population. And this is supposed to be, or hailed as, a great step forward. We oppose that. It's not. It's at most a talking shop. It's a cover for various, aspiring politicians, political figures within the Indigenous community. It's not a way forward. And of course, they all, paint themselves as supporters of the Indigenous population. We now have, and quite frankly, it's quite obscene in my opinion, this welcome to country at every event. After murdering, plundering, killing, poisoning the Indigenous population, capitalist politicians now get up and embrace the welcome to country to cover over the past crimes. They now point to how many Indigenous members of Parliament they have. The issues facing the Indigenous population are the issues of the working class. We have always made the point that the way Australian capitalism came into being, through murder, plunder, and outright extermination, reveals its real character. Its real character to the working class, because it wasn't whites. It's always put under the whites did this, the whites did that. No, the destruction of the Indigenous population, its extermination, was not a problem of whiteness. It was a product of capitalist property relations, which had to impose themselves against the earlier forms of society. And so capitalism came into this country, Australia, dripping in blood, as Marx said, from head to foot. And that's its attitude to the working class. And so we insist that the problems, real problems, from hundreds of years of, 200 years and more of this terrible, attacks on the Indigenous population, attacks on the most oppressed sections of the working class, can only be resolved through the working class and through the struggle for a socialist program. And that's the only way. But look at what's happened. 1967, I well remember it. The referendum, hailed as a step forward, to actually recognise and count Indigenous people in the census. They were just nothing before that. And I remember it well. I thought it was a very important step forward. It was to a certain extent, but very limited. What's been the real condition? They've not improved. They've not developed certain layers, yes, in the Indigenous population, and identity politics is bound up with this, have climbed up. They now want to have a voice in the political sphere. And that's what the Uluru Statement from the Heart is all about, this voice to Parliament. But it doesn't affect, it's not going to change the conditions, in the Northern Territory, in the outback areas, and most importantly, in the working class suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, where like most Redfern. Of the, not just outer western suburbs, Redfern to some extent, well, that's becoming rather gentrified, but outer western suburbs, that's where most of the Aboriginal population face. The problems they face are the problems of the working class. Of course, racism is used very consciously. No one's denying that it doesn't exist, but it's used very consciously, always to split and atomise the working class. And we're for the unification, of the working class.
And okay, the incoming government, they just have this thing called the Uluru Statement, which is just which doesn't talk about a treaty and acknowledgement of the dispossession, but just is basically saying, well give Aboriginal people like a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, it's
going to raise the dispossession and so on. But the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand, the same issues face Maori workers as oppressed sections of the working class, not as Maoris as such. There's a layer, and this is what these treaties are always, there's a layer of the Maori communities who've got very wealthy. They have fishing rights, have timber rights, have land rights, and so on. And the same thing has happened here in Australia to some extent with the land rights questions. There's a layer that's got wealthy, but a very thin layer. That's what treaties are about. They're not about lifting up the mass of the population, because the source of that oppression, as I said, was not the lack of a treaty. The source of that oppression and that degradation and impoverishment is capitalism. The real issues, the task of a socialist program, right, of a socialist policy that we fight for, yes, it'll have to take up, you might say, all the immediate issues of the present day, but also deal with the resolution of all the crimes of the past. We see that as a big responsibility, all the crimes of the past. But it can only be done by the working class and through the fight for a socialist program, not by treaties within the framework of capitalism, which is responsible for the present situation.
And my second to last question before I get to this questionnaire and then let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, evening, is the issue of police brutality. And of course this affects Aboriginal communities. I don't even have to get into the statistics with you. We all know that is a very vicious racial caste capitalist system that Aboriginal people face. Did the Labour Party, the incoming government, did they in their manifesto talk about how they would address the issue of police brutality, the epidemic of deaths in custody, or none at all, including the other parties?
Well, you see, there's been so many. There was the Royal Commission in Deaths in Custody. What is it now? 3 decades ago, nearly. It's got worse since. The incarceration rates have got worse. Because, yes, there's certainly no question there's racism in the police force. We saw it in a recent shooting in the Northern Territory in the trial of a copper who got off. And he was, there's no question of that. But above all, it's a class issue. It's the most impoverished communities and so on. And so we had the Royal Commission in Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And as I said, the situation got worse. So we've had numerous royal commissions. We've had, just to look at another case which illustrates the same point, I'm quoting from memory, but there's been something like 10 royal commissions into aged care and the health system. The conditions have got worse. They've gone down. So it's not just it's not just the Indigenous community. It's everywhere. Royal commissions into this and that, and nothing changes. Not only does nothing change, it actually gets worse. It's the same in Indigenous affairs, police, same in aged care, same in health. So it's above all an expression of the bankruptcy of the capitalist order. There's no progressive, social reforms available. And the increasing incarceration rate or the very high levels that are maintained of the Aboriginal population, they're vastly out of proportion to the total jail population, is going to continue. So, and not going to be solved by royal commissions or whatever.
So, but then, how would your party then tackle the issue of that's facing Aboriginal people? Because if I understand correctly, you're if I understand correctly, you're not for having say a treaty with Aboriginal people, or for the recognition of Aboriginal people in the Australian Constitution. So how would the SCP address the the intergenerational trauma and the grievances of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders?
Well, of course, these issues have to be tackled above all in consultation and so on, and development and working out of policies and program. But what above all is necessary is, the development of resources, because these problems arise out of poverty. They don't arise out of skin. They don't arise out of race. They arise above all out of poverty and the impoverishment. I mean, the destruction, for example, if you want to take the present situation with the settlements, right, and the in the outer regional areas, this started in particular, if we go back to the late 60s, early 70s, we had the Wave Hill stockman strike over wages. That was then diverted into a question of land rights and made a separate issue. It was part of a growing struggle of the working class. And ever since then, and after that, then the stations brought in, helicopters and planes, and they did away with the Aboriginal stockmen. There's no work there whatsoever. So the rejuvenation of, and it's open to Aboriginal communities to decide how and where they want to live. If people want to live in those areas, fine. And resources should be made available so they have a proper living to do that. Many others, of course, want to live in the cities. They want to take part in urban life, and all that has to bring to them, to participate in that. So we're talking about, a general economic and cultural development of the whole society, in which specific problems, handed down by generations to the Aboriginal population, will be dealt with, as they'll be dealt with in other areas. There are other specific areas, but it's not a question of race and so on. That's a socialist program, to meet human need, however it emerges, whether it's aged care, the Aboriginal population, young people, whatever. And that's most of the problems that the problems we confront, arise out of the crisis of the capitalist system. Sure, there'll be specific issues, but the lack of resources is one of them. The lack of decent jobs, the lack of training, the lack of education, that's the key issues that have got to be tackled.
But I do have to take issue with one thing you said. But we don't have time to get into.
What's the issue?
But I would just say that institutional racism is the same side. Is the same side of the coin, along with the issue of institutional classism, which is capitalism.
The most important fight against racism, the most important blow against racism, ethnic, religious divisions, is a unified movement of the working class. Yeah. Let me just give you one example. Take the Egyptian revolution of 2011. There had always been fostered in Egypt. Differences, the Coptic Christians versus the Muslims versus this versus that. A movement of the working class, and those forces came together. You had Islamists looking after Coptic Christians and vice versa. I mean, the same in India. Hindu versus Muslim, exploited. But when you have a unified strike movement, those different. Same in Sri Lanka. Tamil versus Sinhala versus Muslim versus, whatever. The ruling classes use this to divide. The greatest blow against racism is the development of a unified movement of the working class. And that educates people and that's the issue. And of course, it's embedded in the state. They promote it, they encourage it, they always have.
Well, we've covered everything, but before I let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening, because I think it's the evening that's starting to happen in your neck of the wood.
Late afternoon.
So I think we covered everything. But before I let you go, Nick, we usually end the program now with the questionnaire, which Marcel Proust did, later Bernard Pivot in his program did, and my hero, the late James Lipton. And I know, I know you guys at the World Socialist website have a very deep appreciation for the arts, film,
the
music,
actors studio, the actors questions. Yeah, right.
So here it goes. Nick, what is your favorite word?
Socialism. Or equality.
What's your least favorite words?
Racism.
And what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Music gets to parts of the soul that other things can't get to.
And what turns you off?
Hypocrisy.
That's fantastic. What sound or noise do you love?
What sound of noise?
What sound or noise do you love?
I love the gentle lapping of a creek going over the pebbles. It's beautiful.
And what sound or noise do you hate?
Fingernails on a blackboard. I remember from school.
And what's your favorite curse word?
I can't say that on public television.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can.
I suppose the F-bomb is most frequently used.
All right. What profession, if you weren't doing, the brilliant journalism you do and all of the activism you do, what profession would you like? What profession would you love to do?
I'd either be an actor or a great leg spin bowler.
And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Undertaker.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the vision of an afterlife that you believe or don't believe in?
Come and sit down with me. We've got a fine red.
Well, we were joined on this special All Things Australia edition of 1+1 with Nick Beams. He is a member of the Socialist Equality Party of Australia and a frequent contributor to the World Socialist website. Nick, thank you very much for coming on such short notice. It was an honor to speak to you again. I look forward to having you back on the program in the future. And of course, give my best to all of your colleagues. Give my best to Oscar, Chris Marsden over in the Britain, and of course, Thomas Peters and John Braddock of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. But yes, thank you very much, and best wishes until then.
Take care. Look after your health.